Welcome in, Whappers. Hope you guys are enjoying your long weekend. We're off from school tomorrow, so let's get down to business with this ATW where we're going to shift gears quite a bit, and we're going to move from the eastern hemisphere of the world, where we've been concentrating almost exclusively on our topics in Afro-Eurasia, including Oceania as well. But now we're going to shift gears and we're going to move over into what is going to be the Americas. For the first time all year, we're going to fully incorporate the Americas into our discussions. So let's get to it. I'm going to first begin with a general premise that is overarching for whatever region in the Americas that we discuss. And that is the simple fact that long before European explorers and eventually conquerors came to the Americas in the 1500s, the Americas was a highly populated, highly developed, and highly functioning system of civilizations that ranged as far north as Canada and Alaska and all the way down to the southern tip of South America. You can find existences of major civilizations. The Americas was highly developed, highly functioning, and highly successful in terms of building empires and cities. And unfortunately, far too often, the Americas sort of get bulldozed as just being simply pushovers. Because when the Europeans would finally arrive in the 1500s, many of the Native American civilizations that once dominated the hemisphere collapsed so rapidly. And that does give a sort of historical bias in that these empires were not as great and did not exist with as much sort of impressiveness as some of the other empires we've looked at all year. And there are certainly going to be a lot of crossover themes that we need to be aware of when it comes to the empire building of Western Hemisphere American groups as well as Eastern Hemisphere, Afro-Eurasia, and Oceania. So as we dive in here, just want to make sure we all have that point down. Let's start with North America first, and we'll work our way down south, shall we? So, North America, we've got one of the most important premises I want to establish because, frankly, there's just far too many tribes and far too many groups for us to always identify everyone. But where I'd like to begin would be to solidify the idea that within North America, trade routes amongst native groups, even back through the BCE era, up to where we are, 1400s, on the eve, the verge of the European collision. And that's really what I'm going to sort of, I guess, brand this ATW as, this on the eve of Europe's arrival. So the Americas are, especially North America, think Canada, modern-day United States, those regions of the Americas are well connected through trade. There were major trade routes that existed in the modern-day United States, especially along the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River was arguably one of the hot zones, the most flourishing areas of not only trade, but just native activity, native civilizations. And I'm going to give you a great example of a place where we need to have on the map, and that is Cahokia. Cahokia is a city, or was a city, in modern-day Illinois. Modern-day Illinois, Cahokia existed as a powerful center of trade. Estimates from historians are that Cahokia may have been home to about 40,000 natives, which would have put it right on par, in other words, almost equal to London at the time in the 1300s. So major city, major presence, trade. Now, the Mississippi River Valley was an outstanding area of trade within the North America. What the Midwestern, and I'm referring to the Midwestern United States, what these Midwestern groups in the Mississippi Valley were best known as, and there are still lots of good evidence of this throughout the Midwestern United States, they were mound builders. They built these massive mounds out of the earth, and these mounds sometimes stretched as long as 12 football fields, believe it or not. And these mounds were used for ceremonies, perhaps religious ceremonies, which, by the way, the majority of native groups in the Americas were animist of some sorts, and they believed in the spiritual worship of ancestors, things living within nature. They were very much animistic, which is a similarity to many Polynesian groups, many East Asian, African groups as well. So prior to the European arrival, there really was no contact with some of the major world religions. So most native groups tended to be more animistic, and that's how the Mississippi River Valley tribes in places like Cahokia would have been as well. So you've got trade, you've got these mound buildings, which were a symbol of their religion. In Cahokia and other parts of North America too, another important development was that many Native American groups tended to be matrilineal. And we haven't really talked about this term at all. We talked about the opposite of the term, which is patriarchy. But matrilineal societies were ones in which women were sort of not more important than men, but it meant effectively that, number one, women did have greater roles within native groups. It's very similar to African tribes in that regard. And number two, it meant that the lineage of chiefs would often go through the wife's family, her side of the family. So that's a unique feature of many North American native groups. Something else, though, I want to mention about North American native groups is how there was a couple examples, actually two examples in which pre-European native groups formed very highly functioning and organized government systems. Two examples: the Cherokee Nation, which was predominantly the southeastern part of the United States, and the Iroquois Confederacy, which is primarily in the northeastern part of the United States today and into parts of Canada. Between the Cherokee and the Iroquois, these two groups had a confederacy, which is a collection of different tribes that formed an alliance, that formed sort of a joint government in which they came together and they had representatives, and they functioned in a extremely unique style government. Now, at the time in Europe, you really didn't see much of this at all. In fact, you didn't see hardly any of this at all in Europe or Afro-Eurasia. And this style of government was much more similar to some of the later republics that are going to start popping up after the Enlightenment period in the 1800s. So between the Iroquois and the Cherokee, you had some groundbreaking style of governments that existed within native societies, making them far ahead of their counterparts in Europe, for that matter. And the Iroquois and the Cherokee are two great examples of that. So within North America, trade, no matter where you're looking, trade is a common theme. You've got experiments with government, new styles of government, and then you've got this unique feature of matrilineal. I'd say those are really key points within North America. Let's shift on down to Central America, or Mesoamerica, and we're going to focus on a group of natives that dominated Central America, and you know them, I'm sure, quite well. They were a group that lasted from the BCE era all the way up into the Middle Ages, and that would be the Maya. The Maya civilization is one of the great classic era Native American groups within Central America. The Maya are best known for characteristics such as their mathematics, their astronomy, their construction and engineering capabilities, their religious beliefs, which again were very animistic, but the Maya were best known for their use of human sacrifices. They also were incredible in terms of writing. They had a very elaborate writing system with pictures, like pictograms, hieroglyphics style writing, character-based writing. But the Maya, which dominated Central America for thousands of years, the Maya civilizations have just a long-lasting effect, even still to this day. And you'll be seeing pictures that appear here that were from a visit that I took last year to Chichen Itza, which was one of the famous Mayan cities. Now, something about the Mayan governments that I think is very important for us to focus on. Three concepts, really. Three concepts. First, you've got the existence of city-states. The Maya, unlike the Iroquois and Cherokee, for example, did not have a confederation. They did not have this sort of republic-style government. Rather, each city was its own government, and each city had its own king. So it's very much like places in Southeast Asia. We saw a lot of that in Southeast Asia. We talked a lot about that with East Africa on the Swahili coast. And then we also talked about it in terms of, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I'm so sorry. We also talked about it in terms of Italy. Italy, there we go. Italy was a great example. So Italy is a great example of a place that had city-states. So the Maya had city-states, and each city-state, they competed with one another, not for territory, though. It was for trade. Right? The key to building your large city-state, your kingdom, was through trade. And the most powerful of the Mayan city-states would employ a very Chinese-like tribute system. Yes, you heard that right. The tribute system was enacted throughout Central America. So that's one of the most important things I want you guys to take away from the Maya, is the tribute system. There was a very full-fledged tribute system used by the Mayans throughout their civilizations. And so the Mayans were this collection of tribes, united through common language. And the third thing is the practice of human sacrifice. And we can't ignore this, and we're going to talk about this later in more detail. But the Mayans did rely on human sacrifice, which usually came from prisoners of war. When different city-states would fight, they would take conquered peoples and they would use them as sacrificial lambs, so to speak. And these peoples would be offered to the heavens, to the gods. And this was a defining feature of Mayan civilization. But let's not mistake that sort of, from our perspective today, butchery, because the Mayans' knowledge in engineering, construction, with their temples, astronomy, their engineering principles and mathematics were just far, far, far ahead of their time around the world. So don't let the human sacrifice part, fool you into thinking that, these were peoples who did not contribute great cultural legacies within Central America. And moving down further, we're going to leave the Maya where they're at. And the Maya, by the way, actually, I should say before we move on from the Maya, their civilizations began to fade around the 1000s, 1100s. Mayan culture, Mayan language still exists today, so the Maya did not completely die off. But Mayan culture and Mayan peoples sort of eventually became folded into other empires that we'll talk about later this week. But the Maya civilizations kind of collapsed eventually and gave way to different civilizations that came in much later in time. But the last thing I want to mention is labor systems, and I want to focus on South America. So go down into South America now. And South America, again, we'll be talking about some of the empires there. But South America, two things we're going to get to, and then we're almost out of here. Geography and labor systems. I want to mention the geography. So within South America, you can't talk about some of the biggest South American groups without referencing how the Andes Mountains, which were the mountain range on the left side of South America, the Andes Mountains was the dominant geographical feature. And so many native civilizations from South America that flourished were mountain civilizations. And we haven't really talked about that at all. And so within South America, in order to construct such a large empire, they relied heavily on a system of roads. And these roads were very pivotal in the Andes regions of South America in terms of connecting different city-states and different groups together. And as you can imagine, those roads would be important for things like trade. Those roads would be important for things like warfare. You'll be able to mobilize and move your armies around. So system of roads was a very critical part of overcoming the geographical obstacles in South America. And the other part is that South American civilizations, which also did rely on human sacrifice as well, South American civilizations were also had very deeply ingrained labor systems known as the Mita system. And the Mita system was unique because it sort of was used throughout many different native groups in South America. And it was effectively something that the Inca, we'll talk about the Inca, but other groups also used the Mita system, in which you would really do labor for the government. And I wanted to tie this into something we talked about earlier in the year with China, because China had also a similar labor system, which was known as the corvée system. So the Mita and the corvée system are unique in that people would work for the government. They were forced into labor for the government. So building roads, building canals, building any sorts of construction, government buildings and whatnot. So the Mita system was a similar way to force different people into labor who lived in China, very similar to South American societies. And again, we'll be going into more detail of the Inca as well as other groups this week. So enjoy your Monday off, and let's not forget, we celebrate Veterans Day here in the United States, but around the world, November 11th is best known as Armistice Day, in which countries celebrate the end of World War I, which ended at the 11th hour, 11 p.m., the 11th hour on the 11th day of November, which is the 11th month. So 11, 11, 11, a very important historical trivia, dinner party knowledge there. So enjoy your Veterans Day off tomorrow. We're back at it on Tuesday. Hope everyone has a good long weekend. Take care, Whappers. And as always, the past shapes the future.